So the second talk is similar, developing a theme. It's about raising spiritual sons and daughters, or discipleship, we might call it, just producing men and women who go after God. So there's a couple of scriptures just to illustrate that this is an important culture. Again, it's a culture that I'm trying to advocate within local church life, that it's not just for leaders to do, it's for every single Christian as part of a healthy Christian life. Go right back to Genesis. God said to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. Now, multiplying is, in terms of having offspring, naturally, if you think of all the other functions of life, breathing or eating or whatever, those are all things that have to happen or we die. Reproduction doesn't have to happen for us to continue to have life, but it's something that has to be an intentional choice if we are to have a next generation. And I think discipleship is one of those things. Raising spiritual sons and daughters is one of those things. If our lives are just focused on ourselves and our own needs and the now, whether we're leaders or whether we're individual Christians trying to live out our Christian lives, if we're just thinking about the now, just thinking about ourselves, just getting on with the immediate issues, that is not healthy, either for us or for God's church going forward. And that is a culture. Discipleship isn't an event or a program, or it can have some tools that can be useful to it. It is a long-term journey. It's a long-term way of life. And I believe Paul had that culture. So, for example, when he's writing to the Romans in chapter 15, verse 14, he says, when he looks at the Roman church, he said, I myself am satisfied about you, my brothers, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able to instruct one another. But on some points, I've written to you very boldly by way of reminder, because of the grace given me by God. So what he's saying, what he's saying is, when I look at you as a church, you're all involved in discipling one another. You've got good character, you're full of goodness. You've got knowledge, you're filled with all knowledge, you know your Bibles well, and you're able to instruct one another. They've got the skills to be able to just keep the church growing and keep individuals growing and developing in Christ. And he thought that was amazing. And he said, nevertheless, there's a few things I've got grace to write to you about, and I'm going to put my contribution in for your benefit. So he understood that himself. He knew that he was there to serve them, but they were actually all serving one another. That's one of the best ways to grow as a Christian, is to help someone else who's either just become a Christian or who's a little bit perhaps behind you in experience or knowledge, and you can just give them the benefit in a sort of a friendship, family, local church way that can just set them an example that they can grow in. I find that one of the most fulfilling things in my Christian life is to try and think, well, I've had 40 years of so much investment in me and things I've learned. I just want to pass that on to others. I think, well, now I'm nearly 60, so I'm thinking, right, if God gives me another 10 or 15 years, I'd really love to just pass on everything I can to as many people as I can, so that there's a raising up of spiritual sons and daughters that goes way beyond what I can do. We find it also in Philippians when Paul is in prison, right? So his own ministry is curtailed. It's curtailed. He can't do what he wants to do. And he says, I want you to know, brothers, that what's happened to me, in other words, his imprisonment, has really served to advance the gospel. So it became known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Indeed, some preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from good will. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm put here for defense of the gospel. The former proclaimed Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Now, what's he saying? He's saying, look, I haven't been able to do what I would want to do, but there are others around me who, because I've been restricted, they've stepped up. They felt, well, we've got to do what he now can't do because the gospel's got to go forward. And rather than Paul saying, oh, what about my ministry? How dare they? Where's my place going to be when I'm now back in action? What's it going to be like for me when I'm out of this place? I hope they don't start to do my job. He's not saying that. He's saying, I rejoice, even if they're doing it for the wrong motives, some of them. Why? Because the gospel is abounding. He's got this very generous raising up of sons and daughters mentality that thinks, go on, I'm cheering you on. Thank the Lord, he's giving you boldness to step up. Now, when we think about the nations of Europe, I would say if we don't have that mentality, we are never, ever in our generation going to make the slightest dent upon the situation we're facing of very low numbers of evangelical churches. We have to have a priority thinking that says whatever I'm the recipient of in God, I need to pass that on to other sons and daughters in God who I can help become all that they are in God and do and be fruitful. So there's a heart's desire that's got to be in us for us to be healthy Christians. Healthy Christians desire to reproduce disciples to give away other things for the benefit of others. A desire to see people empowered, to see them go ahead of us, to have legacy thinking what's going to happen after me. I want to make sure that I leave a good legacy for people, to entrust people with things that have been entrusted to us. I sometimes describe it when I'm doing teaching on this about being a two-eyed leader. And a two-eyed leader has one eye focused on your own calling, thinking, well, I've got to be able, like Paul, to say, I've run the race, I've done what God has asked me to do. There's no crown of righteousness laid up for me. So we go hard after the calling that God has given us, because that actually sets a good example to people. But then we cover that eye, and the other eye is keeping an eye on those around us who we can train, disciple, encourage, and develop and nurture through, so that we're running after our calling, but we're also helping people discover and flourish in their calling and in the things that God has called them to do. That, I believe, is healthy Christian living and healthy church life and healthy Christian life. And again, it flows out of a family church culture of fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters. It's not a business. It's a family multiplication. Now, just in the 10 minutes we've got, just looking at some tools to try and help form that kind of raising spiritual sons and daughters culture. Now, tools shouldn't ever become the vision, but tools can help us with the vision. And you might be thinking, well, I'd love to just disciple people. Or you might be someone who's trying to disciple people and help them grow in God. And you think, well, there's just so much need. Where do I start? How do I do it? Well, what I've found is a few things that have helped me. That to disciple people, to raise spiritual sons and daughters, does require both formal components where they're taught in classroom or whatever, or in an apprenticeship, learning how to do some things by following us, modeling something to them. But it also requires informal things where we share life, we take people on trips, we pray with people, we have them around our house. There's informal, soft edges where just being with us helps people observe us. If you're a Christian and you're trying to raise up spiritual sons and daughters, people will watch you as much as they will listen to you. They'll watch how you are, they'll watch what you do in life, they'll watch how you handle difficulties, how you handle setbacks, how you handle annoying things. So that they'll be watching the soft edges of life. And that's all part of discipleship, formal and informal. And we've got to let our lives be visible to people. We need components such as knowledge, character, and skills, and just try to think, right, am I helping this person with knowledge, character, and skills? Am I helping them with all of those three areas? Another thing that can be a challenge is time. Think, well, how do I get time to invest in others? Well, one thing that has helped me, that a brother in the Lord shared with me that he found a helpful illustration, and I've adopted this in terms of my own planning. Perhaps you're a leader watching in, or you might be a Christian who feels particularly stirred about discipleship, and you think, how do I fit all this in? There's, say, I don't know, 30 people I know who I'd really love to disciple, but I've only got time, it seems, to give to 3 of them. Well, if we think about the planets in our solar system orbiting around the sun, say, right, so some are further away, some are medium, and some are right close. And these orbits, there might be a short orbit, a medium orbit, or a long orbit. And if you, instead of planets, think about people, and think about you being like the thing that's orbiting around, what I've tried to do is that at some stages of life, there might be key individuals who I think I really need to spend a lot of quality time with this person, because I really feel this is the season to invest in them. And that you might have them on a very short orbit. So every week you might see them, or every day even you might work with them, or a short kind of orbit where they're regularly in your world. There may be some other people who you think, well, I want to keep in regular touch with them, but I don't need to be as in touch with them at the moment in a short orbit. So you might put them on a medium orbit. So you might meet up once a month for a prayer walk, or a coffee and a catch up, or some sort of training thing or whatever. And then there are other people who'll be on a long orbit who you might think, perhaps you spent some time with them regularly at one point or another, and now you think, well, actually they're now serving the Lord in some way, and I just need to touch base with them, I don't know, once every 6 months or so, or once a term or something like that, and they're on a longer orbit. And that might be a meeting, a meal, a ministry trip, or some context. Now, the good thing about orbits is people can change the orbit that they're on, and people who are on a long orbit might suddenly become necessary for you to see more regularly. And likewise, people who you're seeing regularly now might need to be on a slightly different orbit to make room for others. So hopefully, if you can picture that in your mind, I've found that quite helpful. Everybody can change. Nothing's set in stone forever. And as long as people understand right from the beginning how much time you're going to have with them, and then that might change, but it doesn't mean you value them any less. I think starting as you mean to go on, explaining to people how you're going to try and help them really does help when you're trying to figure out, how do I spend the right amount of time with the right people. So I found that helpful, rather than trying to be everything to everyone at once. Now, I would have to say that as leadership influence grows, as your church grows, as the number of people involved in your life, particularly if you're a leader, as that grows, it is inevitable that you're going to disappoint people. It's inevitable. So that's why I've found it helpful to have different kind of orbits in my head, so that I think, okay, rather than trying to do everything and failing at all of it, or not doing anything because it's all too overwhelming, which doesn't help anyone, trying to just plan it a little bit, I've found really, really helpful. And the best way for fruitfulness in the local church, the best way for us to be fruitful and healthy as Christians, is to have in mind the raising up of spiritual sons and daughters, and to pray for those, to look after those. You don't have to have a formal setting for it. There can be people in the church you've just got a heart for, perhaps younger people. You think, I really want to invest in that person. I want to make sure they're all right. Just ring them up once a month, or encourage them in some way. Pray for them in the prayer meeting when it's time to pray with different people. Make a point of praying with them. Contact them. How can I pray for you? How can I help you? How can I stand with you? Show an interest in people. I think we underestimate the power of spiritual mothers and fathers taking an interest and caring for and standing with, for the long term, spiritual sons and daughters coming through in our ranks. And that's the way, actually, to, in the long term, have a strategy of church planting and mission multiplication. You've got to invest in those relationships of spiritual sons and daughters. over a long period of time, and probably give most of your, if you're in leadership, give most of your prime people time to people that you are wanting to really bless and invest in. That doesn't mean that you don't see everybody that's appropriate. I'm not saying that. But you'll notice that Paul was intentional. Jesus was intentional. He said he called the 12, those he wanted to be with him. Now, he ministered to the crowds. He had time for everyone. But he didn't have the same amount of time for everyone. He would minister to the crowds, then he would withdraw, then he would take the 12 with him, then he'd take the 3 with him. He gave proportionate amounts of time to those he was training, who he knew would be a blessing to many more crowds than he could even reach. So there is something actually very Jesus-like about this model of orbits. Jesus had orbits of proximity to different types of people. Okay, so I think we're about done on that session, so time for some more questions.
Great. All right. Thank you. Our first question here says, at what point is somebody able to disciple others? Is there a required amount of training that is necessary prior to somebody discipling somebody else?
Well, I think the answer is probably, I heard it once said by one Bible teacher, you only have to be one verse ahead of the person that you're trying to train. And I like that, because I think if you know just one bit more than someone else knows, then you can pass it on. So I don't think it's just trying to stand alongside people, and it doesn't have to always be one-way traffic. Sometimes the people we're discipling can teach us as much. It's more about the journey. It's more about the journey together and learning together. And often, if people ask me a question and I think, well, I actually don't know the answer to that, I'll say, look, I don't know, I'll find out. So the next time we meet, we can talk about it. So I don't think we have to be, miles ahead of someone. I think we have to love the Lord, be setting a good example, be committed to growing ourselves, and people get in the slipstream of that, and you do it together as much as anything, rather than it being like an expert and a novice. It's not that kind of image. So I don't think you have to get a certificate or something. Probably best not to.
Great, thank you. How about this question here? It says, is discipleship between like males and females okay, or should it remain men to men and women with women?
Well, I think you just have to set things up differently. I think certainly you can have input into both men and women, but there's ways of doing that. So I think if discipling women, then the best way is either in a mixed group or in a collective group. And then it's most important that that's probably more coaching rather than mentoring, because I think problems do happen, whether it's even women discipling men or men discipling women. It can happen either way around. There can be problems if people form an emotional attachment that's very on its own. I think that it's not healthy for either. But I think certainly we have to find creative ways of discipling the opposite sex to what we are. I think that can be done, and just needs to be done, thoughtfully and accountably and wisely, collectively. I think most discipleship actually is best done in collective settings anyway. Now, there are times when I, for example, will see people one-to-one, other guys who I'm investing in, but most of the time I think it works really well when you've got a small number of you. And so obviously that could be men and women together, or all men or all women, if you've then got appropriate things set up. So just to be wise, I think, is the way forward on that one.
Great, thank you. Our next question says, how do you know when it's time to move on from discipling somebody?
Well, I would say it's more likely that they would go on a longer orbit rather than, I don't want to drop someone and think, because otherwise that makes them a product. And so, the people I've invested in, I still know and have contact with who I've known for years, but they may be on a very long orbit because we just don't see each other very often. But that doesn't mean that you don't cut people off. That's part of the family dynamic. And there probably are times when even the longest orbit can involve like a conference where everyone's together, and you might get just some great time around a coffee or something with someone you haven't seen for a long while. So I think families shouldn't get to the point where no one speaks to someone else in the family. That's not a healthy family, is it? So if you're a family, you're a family. And whether you're in different nations, or a lot of the people I'm working with are in different nations, so I don't see them physically very often. I think that's one of the benefits of things like Zoom. Zoom doesn't really help you form relationships, but it can help maintain them. And I think, I literally talk to people the other side of the world quite often. And we just have to figure out time zones and things, who's going to take the hit this time. But we kind of, we're connected through relationship, not through a sort of a course.
Great, that makes good sense. Thank you. Our next question here asks, how can you stimulate and empower a whole church culture of discipleship that endures but does not feel like a project?
Well, I have to refer it back to the first session, where I can't overstate the importance of family as the culture, because if you don't have family as the culture, then discipleship will feel like a project or a process producing some sort of sausage machine of, people who will do a job. Now that's not raising sons and daughters. That deliberately in the title, I don't like the word discipleship on its own. Partly because I don't actually think it's in the Bible as a verb quite like that. I do find reference to fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters. I find references to those kinds of dynamics. So I think we are in it together for the long haul. I want to pass on everything I've got to anyone who wants it, and so that's a lifestyle. It's not a project. It's because I see the value, I see gifting in people and potential in someone, and perhaps I've got more faith for them than they might even have for themselves. So I want to help them become what they can be in God. I get a buzz out of that. I find that I'm not thinking of it as a product. I'm thinking I'm helping them become what God really has got his hand on them to be. And so I think that, to be honest, can only come from a relational footing. If we're in leadership and we're just trying to find people to do jobs, people will sniff that in the end, and they'll think I'm being used here, and I'm being used to prop up your ministry. And I don't think that that won't end well.
Oh, great, thanks. Our next question asks, if a church has been more home group focused, what helps to move it towards smaller groups of discipleship?
Well, I mean, home groups can be contexts for discipleship. I suppose I would say if a home group hasn't got a discipleship component in it, I'd think, well, what is it doing then? Because everyone should be growing, which to me is the point of the home group. If people aren't growing, then stop it, start another one, because we should all be making some progress in our Christian lives. That's what being together is all about. No, progress is meticulously slow very often in the Christian life. I mean, I think our consumer culture would love it to be that we could just go somewhere, have some experience, and we're wonderfully changed in the twinkling of an eye. That's not been my experience. I would say there are moments of encounter, definitely, but some of us have a Damascus road and some of us have an Emmaus road. And sometimes we have both of those things at different points in our lives. And an Emmaus road, you're walking with the Lord, and he's talking, opening up scriptures, he's counseling you as you walk with him. A Damascus road, obviously, you might get knocked off your horse every now and again, but you can't live the Christian life on one or the other. Both components will be there. Mostly, it will be Emmaus road, though, I would think.
Great, thanks. Let's do one more question. Here we go. How do you prevent a leader from becoming prideful? Leaders can get lost when knowing like their people need them.
How do you prevent a leader from getting like that? Well, pray for them would be a good start. I think if a leader makes anyone feel they couldn't say that to them, then there's a problem. Now, sadly, in most churches, I find too many people feel far too free with their comments. They say things they shouldn't say, but not very nice. But assuming there's a good-hearted person and, you know, with godly motives, who genuinely wants to be a blessing to their leader or leaders, and thinks, you know what, I'm just a bit concerned for how you are at the moment, how you're coming over. I would want someone to tell me that in love, someone I knew had my best interests at heart. If people haven't got your best interests at heart, well, go and get their best interest at heart first, then talk to them, because otherwise it's just criticism and tearing people down. I'm not advocating that. But if you love your leader or your leaders and you think, I'm just a bit concerned how they're coming over at the moment, they feel a bit driven or whatever, I'd want someone to tell me that, because we're a family. Comes back to the original point. Families are honest with each other. Pick the right moment, of course, and say it in the right way. But it's not a hierarchy. We should only ever give people titles to define their role, not to give them status. So if anyone has any kind of badge of leader, it's only to define what their serving role is. Doesn't mean they're higher or more elevated than anyone else at all. That's a misnomer. We are all equal in Christ. We're a priesthood of all believers together. We just have different roles and functions. So we should be able to talk to one another, admonish one another, you know, encourage one another, strengthen one another, challenge one another. That's biblical family dynamics.